What I hope to do is break this down, actually addressing a bit of Kieran's question of how do we take this big attainment gap that we say, well, that's from when students start to when they finish, and try and start to break it down. So this talk is focused a little bit on data, so you'll get more on the nice theories of personal tutoring later today. But this is about one of the tools that you can actually start to use as you go along, because the problem is this gap, it builds over time. So one of the things that I'm going to talk to today is how we can use data on learning gain, which is sort of broadly any sort of data about students learning, to kind of help address that gap as we go along. So we don't wait till a student finishes and says, whoops, missed it with that cohort again. But how do we start at the beginning and track this over time so we don't let it go each term and build into each year and wait till the student's end point to then think it's something we have to address. This also gives us tools to start addressing it now. And also, like Sam said, it puts some numbers on things that can help kind of take colleagues on the journey that we're talking about, who might not think this is happening. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about learning gain metrics, how learning gain metrics can be used in practice, and the enhancement and ethics. And I'm going to breeze through a bit of this because all the nitty-gritty detail is available on the OFS website under their projects about learning gain. So you can find it all there, download, it's free. It's really fun to read. I swear it won't put you to sleep. And so you can get the details there. So one of the projects I'm involved in is evaluating a set of projects on learning gain. So these have been running for almost 3 years now. They were originally funded by HEFKE, sense a theme here, now transferred to the Office for Students. And this builds on work that's been going on for about 5 years predominantly in England, looking at different ways to capture student learning and how to look at that. And these projects focus on different methods that can be used to capture student learning, measure it as students go through their courses. So there's a set of 13 projects set in different institutions, but over 70 universities. Hands up if you know your university is part of one. Yeah, okay, most of you probably are actually. You just don't know it because sometimes these things aren't communicated that well. And there's also a national mixed methodology project with another 10 institutions and some internal analysis being done within what used to be HEFKE and is now OFS, linking a lot of the national data sets together to see how they can kind of track things like some of these gaps happening from linking all the schools data sets, entry, UCAS data, linking that then with institutional data and tax data going on. So it links into students' earnings and incomes as they go further along. What the projects are broadly looking at are capturing learning. So what is learning? Well, in analyzing the different approaches that have been taken, I've sort of summarized 3 broad areas of data that they're working on capturing. Firstly is affective measures. So these are how students feel, often in conjunction with how they feel about something. So there's quite a lot of overlap in these terms, but different terms are used, and a lot of the projects come from sort of different disciplinary standpoints. But everything on student self-efficacy, well-being, disposition to learning, confidence, resilience, satisfaction. And I want to stop and briefly critique the one up from the bottom. This sense of resilience, what a lot of people love. A lot of employers say, yeah, that's a good one. I want nice, resilient employees. And everybody goes, yeah, we're going to build their resilience. Maybe we'll pour a bit of it on top of their heads and they'll just be more resilient. But I think this is a real challenging one because what a lot of resilience is, this is my kind of personal critique, is a kind of neoliberal sense that it puts difficulties on an individual. And like those quotes that Sam showed on the lectures, I faced difficulties and I overcame it and I'm resilient. And I think you could do the same thing too. And what it has a danger of doing is ignoring that actually it's not a level playing field that people start out in. And in fact, what you get with a lot of resilience is it can be an excuse for hardships and structures that are sexist, racist, biased in all sorts of ways. And it sort of says, well, I'm more resilient because I succeeded, but actually maybe I didn't face the same challenges someone else did. And this then builds over time. So there's kind of a difficulty in this one on resilience of kind of who do you grant resilience to? And some students might come to university having faced huge battles beforehand and coming in with heapfuls of resilience. and how is that acknowledged? So this is a real tricky one where we get into some of these effective measures, particularly not understanding where students start from. And similar with confidence, some students might have very high grades, but maybe they don't actually feel they've done a lot to earn them. Maybe they felt they were kind of spoon-fed through schooling, and they don't actually have a lot of confidence to face new and challenging things. Might be really good at taking tests, but not good in other capacities. So there's a lot of difficulties about what are the kind of starting points for some of these effective measures. And also, these aren't linear measures, as in your confidence can go up and down. And sometimes you learn the most when you're in a learning environment and you hit that moment where you learned how much you don't know. It's that kind of when you start a lit review and you think, oh, this is simple, a quick lit review on personal tutoring. And then you go, oh God, there's a whole world out there I didn't know. And that dip would hurt your confidence. Your confidence would go down, but your learning would actually go up. So these are quite complicated measures. Behavioral measures. So these are things that students do. They're things you can measure whether they do, and you can measure the sort of effective relationship with how students do them. A lot of interest in what are the outcomes of students participating in work experience or study abroad experiences or international experiences. What do they get out of these? Different ways that students engage with online environments. Of course, you can track all of that data. Students who spend X number of hours logged into the VLE, what are the repercussions of that? So these are different effective measures. And then this bottom one, I think, has quite a lot of interest with what we're going to talk about, these learning analytics. A lot of this is, how do we put all the data that we capture on students' learning together, and then what would we do with that? So these are different behavioral measures covering these different activities. So they're not things students might intend to do, but they're just measuring what they actually do. How often do they go to class, participate in class, go to seminars, etc., inside and outside of the classroom. And then the last one are cognitive measures, which some people thought, well, this is what I thought learning gain was about. This is about how much you've sort of learned in your head. But actually, when we break down what students are learning, it does actually cover the affective, behavioral, and these cognitive measures, which are both some areas of general cognitive gain, which some people kind of think critical thinking, for example, might be sort of general, and other aspects that would be more disciplinary specific. And I think that's what the projects have really struggled with, is actually pretty much it's all disciplinary specific, because students are very discipline specific degrees, meaning that it's hard to kind of pull out generic learning that's of interest or use to anyone. So it's difficult to make comparisons across the piece on how students are doing, but it does mean you can make comparisons within students of a similar course and across institutions. So that's actually where a lot of the richness of the data comes in, and how students are approaching these. So a number of the projects, like I said, they'll look at things like students' confidence in using research methods. So these methods are sort of intertwined, or their confidence and ability to do research, for example. So each of the projects takes different combination sets of these measures and approaches different methodological tools to sort of capture these. So we take these different kind of process measures of what we're trying to capture, and then you kind of go, so what's the kind of outcome? We talked a lot, Sam's presentation talked about attainment, so that's one kind of outcome measure you can use. Grades, actually a lot of problems with grades, they're quite biased. Lots of people give them, they're not necessarily standardized. They keep inflating, just getting bigger and bigger, which is a concern for the government at the moment. So those are some things you can measure. Progression, depending on type of institution, that might be a more or less useful metric. And what most projects ended up saying was, well, at the end, we're measuring employability skills. And everyone nods their head and go, yeah, that's good. That's a nice reason to go to higher education, employability skills. And you go, so what do you mean by employability skills? Well, when you break that down, what you actually get are different combinations of these effective behavioral and cognitive measures. That's what employability skills are. Do you have confidence? Do you have content knowledge? Do you have experience? And these employability skills go back to these kind of learning metrics we were talking about earlier. But the big question is, well, what is it we actually want to capture out of this? Goes back to what I would call both a philosophical and a political question of, well, what do you think the purpose of higher education is? So you pick the different measures that you think are important to account for, depending on what you think higher education's for. If you think if it's for training people in certain professions, then you would pick certain metrics that would address that. If you think higher education's about social mobility, you would pick different metrics to measure that. If you think it's about, knowledge graduates for the 21st century, again, different metrics. If you think it's about a love of lifelong learning and inculcating a personal sense of development, you would pick different metrics. So that's why it becomes quite political about which metrics you select to say you think are important. And these are debates that are occurring right now and how some of this work moves forward. So broadly, out of the learning gain projects, like I just said, depends on your purpose of higher education. And some people within institutions might say, well, I have my personal view and then I have my representative view of what I kind of think, maybe in terms of a manager it's this, but personally I think it's that. And it's also not only those who work in higher education, it's also the students. Why are they going to higher education? What are they signing up to their degree for? We have these multiple different aspects. This third one's quite tricky for anyone who does any sort of policy-oriented research, and that learning gain is really highlighting that there's a gap between methodological precision, accuracy, and rigor, especially with the magical things that you can do with a computer and SPSS these days, particularly with large data sets, and what's actually practical in terms of collecting and practical in terms of people using on a regular basis. So there's kind of one angle of learning gain that could get you lots of publications in 4-star journals, and another direction that would be actually giving data that real people could use in institutions. So there's quite a trade-off of some people wanting to kind of go on and on about methods, which obviously need to be accurate. You need to be giving the right kind of data, but you can go too far down that path. And I've seen some very crazy complicated graphs. Has anyone seen violin charts? I didn't know if the blob was supposed to be big or small or narrow, and they're like, see, look, this one's pink and that one's blue, and I was like, what? I'm like, I'm supposed to know about this stuff. I was like, oh, geez. But I think what's really emerging, which is why I'm talking about this learning gain work in the context of the RAW project, is for any of this data to be of any use to students, which is like the only reason to collect is to try and create some change on the ground, is students need support, advice, and guidance to make sense of it. You cannot just give students a dashboard, even with simple numbers, and just think that will magically turn their behavior around. Same with staff. Staff need support, advice, and guidance to make sense of this too. And any engagement with this depends on how the data will be used, put into practice. So it's needing to collect it, but then having that part of a feedback cycle of how someone makes sense of it. So I'm going to talk briefly about some of the ways learning gain data can be used before I just touch on the tutoring context. So from the last report I wrote, these are a set of different uses at a whole variety of levels, everything from prospective students to the government, all the different institutional aspects in between. People really like using learning gain data for these purposes. I think it's quite nice. For current students, being able for the data to be reflective, a lot of the tools themselves help students reflect on their learning in terms of how you manage courses and how you manage a classroom. A lot of projects, staff have been testing innovative pedagogies, so actually testing what students get out of a flipped classroom session or a flipped classroom module. And then the next term trying something else, so actually doing proper evaluation of innovation. A lot of projects, because they're focused on these employability skills, use the data to enhance career services, target specific students who are maybe less sure about what they're going to go on to do next at kind of key moments in their decision-making phase. And also with employers, kind of giving better data to employers on how to select graduates, how to select a more diverse set of graduates beyond some of the metrics we currently use. So lots of academics very happy with learning gain when you talk about it in those ways. Oh, but then once you start to use it with the managers, then bad things happen. So a lot of people are quite concerned about, it's fine if I use this for my own pedagogical enhancement, but it's going to be really bad once the managers get a handle on it. And this is often just said in quite like that managers almost like aren't people or aren't teaching academics themselves, which in a lot of cases they are. But there's a sense that then it starts, once it feeds into program review, then everyone's going to start to somehow magically have to teach, to what the metrics are, and people are going to get held to account for things they don't think they should be. If it's used for benchmarking, if anything's made public, then it's going to go into rankings, and that's seen inherently as very, very bad. If the government's going to start using it to accountability, that's really bad. If students are going to start making choices off it, that seems bad. So there's this negative tone to a lot of the learning gain data, but I think one of the reasons why I'm actually sticking with this, even though there are these challenges that are out there, is right now, a lot of students, when you ask how their learning's being accounted for, it's off student satisfaction and graduate salary data, which are quite poor proxies for learning, actually. Satisfaction's often actually inversely related to learning. Pizza and biscuits go a long way to making students happy. And easy assessments and telling them exactly what they're going to be assessed on. So some of these things that are actually not conducive to the learning process. So the idea with learning gain data is that you would get people, they might do some of this gaming and chasing metrics, but it would be about improving the student learning experience as you go along, because you're actually measuring something closer to what it is you're trying to achieve when you're teaching students and supporting students through their learning. So it's about trying to have better metrics, not ideal metrics, not the perfect metrics or single metric, but better metrics to capture how students are learning, and metrics that help students as they go through their courses understand their learning, and also give graduates more data about the variety of skills that they've achieved through their higher education degree, besides a 2-1 from X university, to help them be more employable. When we talk about enhancement, loads of ways that these personalized dashboards have been developed, but again, they need to be talked through with students. Students need to be explained what the data means. Instruments as reflective pedagogical tools. Quite a lot of the surveys, questionnaires, interviews that students have done, it helps them reflect on their learning as they complete them. If you ask questions around like good educational behaviors, it gets students thinking about them. If they fill out surveys about how many questions have you asked in class, they go, maybe I should ask a few more questions in class. How do you spend your time? They go, actually, maybe I should spend a bit more time, on my course and maybe a little bit less time on Love Island. Evaluating classroom interventions, enhancing the course experience. This is a really important one for working with course teams, which is this shift from module mania, as in I'm an academic and I teach a module, and I've talked to a huge number of academics who actually don't know the modules that the students take before or after the module they teach, or even more worryingly, the other modules that students are taking at the same time, which is how a student experiences their course at one point in time. They are living those, 3 or 4 modules they are taking together, not your module that you teach in isolation. And that's actually, I think, really important when we talk about personal tutoring, because what a lot of students do is they don't know how to prioritize the efforts they put into the variety of modules they're taking at one point in time. So you can't just look at it one by one, because for a student it's, well, I did really well on my paper in X, but then I failed the 3 other ones. But I did that one really well, because they don't know how to balance it out. So a lot of personal tutoring needs to take into account the student's course as they're experiencing it, not single data points in individual modules. And in institutional initiatives, in terms of targeting attainment gaps, a couple of the projects have done really interesting things where they take these attainment gaps at the end and they start to model all of their institutional data to find out where is that starting. And you can do this on a course-by-course basis. And some even found out, it would be certain pathways of order of modules that students took that would lead to, basically there's a path to success and a path to failure. So you can actually start to use this data to break it down and then not only know that, but then go to course teams and start to explain how this data is leading to attainment gaps growing. Some found actually that throughout the first year there was no gap and the gap started in the second year. Some found the gaps started and got wider, some found gaps shrunk, and so you can start to go in and actually use this data. And when the analysts went in and talked to the course teams, that's where this learning started to occur. Because suddenly they got this data, and it was like, this is your data on your students that you teach, and it started to seem very real. And it wasn't something you'd say, well, that's not occurring. It was like, well, yeah, here you go. and here's it in a whole bunch of different forms. So kind of doing toolkits around this is a really interesting way to start to use this data to help staff understand and then be able also to take this to students with their learning. When we talk to students about this, they want someone who knows them, knows the course they're on, understands the teaching that's happening to explain this to them. And there's no one better placed than their personal tutor. That's really the person who's going to be the best translator of this data to the student, what it means, not someone who's analyzing the data in a central office, not managers and administrators, but someone who understands how this relates to the teaching that students are doing. That's who they really want to talk to. This also provides, so I've done some interviews as part of the RAW project, and I love doing interviews because you just get the very real story. A lot of students are like, well, I don't go talk to my personal tutor because it's very awkward. I don't have a problem, so I haven't ever spoken to them because it would be weird to just go and say hi. You know, it's in a British context after all. We don't want to have awkward, weird conversations with people we don't really know. So then what we found is that students don't develop that baseline relationship to then if they do have a problem, feel like it's someone they feel comfortable talking to. But actually what this data does is gives you something to have a conversation about. That's somewhat neutral. You could go in and kind of say, well, look, we looked at this is where you're positioned, let me talk you through your dashboard, and it starts to build that relationship and gives them something to talk about that's meaningful to the student and is of interest to the tutor because it's about their teaching on the course. So it kind of helps kickstart that relationship and gives you something concretely to talk on when you continue to have these meetings. Just going to conclude with some cautionary points. The triangle of doom has emerged around these projects, which is these notions of data protection, data sharing, and research ethics. Even prior to GDPR, these are all significant concerns. What's appropriate to share? How is the data used? A lot of students are concerned about learning gain data being looked at actually by the staff who teach on their course, who might make judgments about them and their progress, how they're learning. So lots of concerns about the ethics, what students are thinking they're signing up for with this. I think the only way around some of these issues is to bring students more into the conversation, more into the data collection, so they're actually part of it rather than it's being something that's done to them. These activities need to be built into a student's course, or else it's really difficult to get students to complete anything that's in addition to their course. Students really struggle to make sense of this data if they're left on their own. There is a worrying fear of a pact of disengagement. So that's this research that's been done for a while out of the US. It kind of says, well, academics just won't really bother students with much. I mean, they won't give this, give them their data, push them a lot on assignments. Students, in turn, won't ask a lot of their tutors. Not too many teaching hours, not a lot of extra supervision sessions. So you kind of agree, I'm going to leave you alone, you leave me alone. As long as I get a decent grade in the end, that's fine. And I think this learning gain data can kind of help be something that helps get into that and break down that pact of disengagement and get both sides working a bit more. One thing with student engagement, which is what we run into looking at satisfaction data, that you can't go so far down kind of a student as consumer model with this, because what they want is often not what's good for them. It's kind of eating your broccoli approach. I have small children, spend a lot of time on broccoli. Sing whole songs about broccoli. So how do we start to push students towards the behaviors that might not be comfortable, might not be the things they want to do, but are the things that will help them progress, and the things that we know are linked to positive outcomes and student success. And I'm just going to wrap up by talking briefly about there's huge opportunities to engage students in this. This will only work if this is something that students are part of. This needs to be done with students, not about them and not for them. Because if all this data is collected and you give it to a student, they go, I don't know, what that means, or you didn't collect that in a way that's meaningful in relation to my course, then there's kind of no point in collecting it at all. Then it's all kind of a waste of time. You can write all these reports, but if it doesn't lead to a change in behavior, then it was just kind of, a waste of your time. And students need to be part of the kind of evaluation planning. Where are you trying to get to? What is success for students? Data gathering, data analysis. That's where I've had huge success in sort of students' interpretations of things like transcripts or qualitative comments are often hugely rich in terms of how they pull out what this means for students. and how they understand the course and what it means and what's happening on the ground. Actioning data, so turning the data into like, well, how do we turn this around? And interestingly, if you ask students that question, they tend to come up with kind of what I like to call free suggestions, little things, you know, that if people did would make a big difference to students. If you ask a member of staff what you need, it's always another full FTE. I need another full-time member of staff is the only solution to the problem here. But that's very rarely what students say. And in terms of feedback and follow-up with the data. So I hope that as part of this seminar today, we think about when we hear people talk about personal tutoring, what are some of the actual ways we could start to capture some of the things that we want to talk to students about. This doesn't mean it's also solely quantitative data. There's lots of qualitative data that could feed into this. That just helps kickstart these tutoring relationships, helps to identify gaps before they, you know, as they go along, so there's something that you could do something about while students are studying. So this isn't something that's always done retrospectively, but can actually be done starting from right now to help the students who are studying as they go along. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.